I still remember the look on Richard's face when he smiled and said, "You'll never win against me, Fiona. You don't own this house. You don't own our savings. You signed everything away years ago." My hands trembled, but I refused to let him see it. After 28 years of trusting my husband, I had just learned I might walk away with nothing. Then I looked him in the eye and quietly said, "Maybe, but I already hired the one lawyer you've been afraid of for years." His smile disappeared before I even finished the sentence. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could betray you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if my story touches your heart, please consider liking and subscribing so we can continue this journey together. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'd truly love to know. When people ask me when my marriage began to fall apart, they usually expect me to name one terrible fight or one shocking betrayal. The truth is much quieter than that. Looking back now, I don't believe my marriage collapsed in a single moment. I think it happened one small decision at a time, spread across 28 years so gently that I never noticed the ground disappearing beneath my feet. I met Richard Grant when I was 29 years old. I had just accepted a position as an elementary school librarian in Columbus, Ohio. I loved my work. Every morning, I watched children discover books that would become their favorites for life. There was something magical about helping a shy second grader find a story that suddenly made reading exciting. My salary wasn't impressive, but I felt rich in purpose. Richard was different from anyone I had dated before. He was confident without seeming arrogant, organized without appearing controlling. He remembered little details about me that even I forgot. If I mentioned enjoying lemon pie during one conversation, he'd surprise me with one from my favorite bakery 2 weeks later. He listened. At least, that's what I believed. Our first year together felt effortless. We spent weekends exploring antique stores, driving through little Ohio towns, and dreaming about the future. Richard often talked about building something meaningful, a construction company that would someday allow us to retire comfortably. "I don't want us worrying about money forever," he told me one evening as we sat beside the river watching the sunset. Neither did I. When he proposed, I never hesitated. My parents adored him. My friends thought I had found one of the good ones. Even my co-workers commented on how patient and thoughtful he seemed whenever he visited the library to surprise me with lunch. For many years, I believed they were right. Our daughter Lauren was born 3 years after we married. The day I held her for the first time, every plan I'd ever made suddenly seemed less important than protecting this tiny little girl sleeping peacefully against my chest. Richard suggested something that sounded perfectly reasonable. "You've always wanted to spend more time with our kids someday," he said gently. "Why don't you leave the library for a few years? My business is growing. We can afford it." I hesitated. "I don't want to become completely dependent." He smiled and squeezed my hand. "You won't be dependent. You'll be my partner. I'll earn the paycheck and you'll build our family. That's just as important." At the time, his words felt loving. Today, I hear something completely different. Still, I left my job. I told myself I could always return later. Years passed more quickly than I imagined. Lauren started kindergarten, then middle school, then high school. Every stage of her life arrived before I felt ready. Richard's company expanded faster than either of us expected. New trucks appeared in the driveway. Bigger clients called regularly. We moved into a beautiful 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood where everyone seemed successful. From the outside, our lives looked almost perfect. Inside, tiny changes began happening. Changes so small that they barely seemed worth mentioning. Richard insisted on handling all our finances. "I actually enjoy this stuff," He'd laugh while organizing receipts at the dining room table. I'd probably mess everything up anyway, I'd joke back. He kissed my forehead. Exactly. Let me worry about it. It became our routine. Taxes, Richard handled them. Retirement accounts, Richard managed them. Insurance already taken care of. Mortgage paperwork, he'd sign whatever was necessary and simply point to the lines where I needed my signature. At first, I read every page. The documents were long, confusing, and filled with legal language I barely understood. Richard noticed me struggling. Sweetheart, he said kindly one evening, I've already reviewed everything with our accountant. You're wasting your time reading 30 pages of legal jargon. He wasn't impatient. Not then. He sounded protective. So I stopped reading. Whenever he handed me papers, I'd ask only one question. Where do I sign? He always smiled. Right here. Sometimes he'd explain what I was signing. Sometimes he wouldn't. I never pushed, because that's what trust looked like in my mind. As the years continued, other little habits developed. Bank statements no longer arrived in the mailbox. They're electronic now, Richard explained. Credit card accounts switched almost entirely into his online system. It's easier this way. Investment reports stopped appearing on the kitchen counter. I already filed them. Whenever I asked how our retirement savings were growing, his answer rarely changed. We're doing great. When I asked for details, he'd laugh. You really want percentages during dinner? I laughed too. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. There were moments that should have made me pause. Once I needed proof of income while helping Lauren complete paperwork for a scholarship application. I'll print it tomorrow, Richard said. He never did. I asked again. I've been busy. Eventually, I stopped asking. Another time, I suggested meeting with our financial advisor together. Richard looked surprised. Why, I thought maybe I should understand everything too. His smile faded just slightly. You trust me, don't you? The question caught me off guard. Of course. Then why would you need another explanation? I immediately felt guilty, as though asking questions somehow meant I doubted him. So I apologized. I apologized for wanting to understand my own finances. That memory still hurts. Over time, I noticed something else. Whenever friends discussed investments or retirement planning during neighborhood dinners, Richard answered every question directed toward me. Fiona doesn't worry about numbers. She lets me handle all that. Everyone laughed, including me. It became part of our identity as a couple. Richard was the practical one. I was the caring one. No one saw anything unusual. Neither did I. I often thanked him for carrying what I believed was the heavier burden. You work so hard for us. I'd tell him. He always answered the same way. I'd do anything for this family. And maybe in his own mind, he believed that. The frightening thing about manipulation isn't that it always looks cruel. Sometimes it looks thoughtful. Sometimes it looks responsible. Sometimes it even feels like love. Years slipped away. Lauren graduated from college and became a pediatric nurse. Richard's business became one of the most respected construction companies in Central Ohio. We traveled occasionally, hosted Thanksgiving dinners, celebrated anniversaries surrounded by smiling photographs. Anyone looking through our family albums would probably envy our life. I certainly did, until one ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was cleaning the hallway closet when I needed a copy of our homeowner's insurance policy for a contractor replacing our roof. I searched every folder. Nothing. I checked Richard's office. Locked. That surprised me. His office had never been locked before. When I asked about it that evening, his answer was quick. I've got confidential business contracts in there now. It sounded reasonable, but something about the way he avoided my eyes stayed with me. That night, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, I lay awake wondering something I had never seriously asked myself before. Why didn't I know where any of our important documents were? The question refused to leave. Over the following weeks, I casually asked more questions. How much remained on our mortgage? Which bank held our retirement accounts? How many investment accounts did we actually have? Every answer felt strangely incomplete. I'll show you later. You don't need to worry. I've already handled it. Those words suddenly sounded different, not comforting, dismissive. I wish I could tell you that I immediately recognized what was happening. I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself I was becoming forgetful. Maybe menopause had made me more anxious. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe Richard really was protecting me from unnecessary stress. That's the lie I told myself, because accepting another possibility was too frightening. I couldn't imagine that the man I'd loved for nearly 30 years had quietly built a life where almost everything belonged to him, and almost nothing belonged to me. Only later would I discover just how completely I had mistaken dependence for security. For weeks after I found Richard's office locked, I tried convincing myself I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I told myself every successful marriage went through seasons. Maybe I had simply become restless now that Lauren was grown and living on her own. Maybe I needed a hobby instead of questions. But something inside me had changed. Once you begin noticing little cracks, it's impossible to pretend the wall is still perfect. Richard noticed my curiosity almost immediately. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, I casually asked, "Who manages our retirement accounts? Now is it still the same financial advisor?" He didn't even look up from rinsing his plate. "Why? I was just wondering." "They're doing fine." "I know. I was just curious." He set the plate down harder than necessary. "Fiona, you've never cared about this before." The words stung more than I expected. "I guess I should have." He forced a smile. "You're worrying about nothing." Then he kissed my forehead and walked upstairs. Years earlier, that kiss would have comforted me. Now it felt like a conversation had just been shut down. Over the next several days, I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Richard took nearly every business call in his home office with the door closed. Whenever I entered unexpectedly, he minimized something on his computer screen before turning toward me. If paperwork arrived in the mail, he collected it before I had the chance. Little things. Always little things. Enough to make me uneasy. Not enough to accuse anyone of anything. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Richard believed I was spending the afternoon shopping with a friend. Instead, my lunch plans had been canceled, and I returned home nearly 2 hours earlier than expected. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Richard's truck was still there. That surprised me. He was supposed to be meeting his accountant downtown. I entered through the garage as quietly as possible. The house was unusually silent, except for faint voices coming from Richard's office. The office door wasn't fully closed. It was open just enough for sound to drift into the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, at least not at first. Then I heard my name. "Ugh. She still has no idea," Richard said. I froze. Another man chuckled softly. It sounded like his accountant, David Collins. David had handled Richard's business taxes for years. I stepped closer without making a sound. Richard laughed. "If Fiona ever files for divorce, she'll walk away shocked." David answered carefully. "I still think you should prepare for every possibility." Richard laughed even harder. "There isn't much she can do." A knot formed in my stomach. David lowered his voice. "She's been your wife almost 30 years. So, there are judges who won't appreciate—" Richard interrupted him. "I've spent decades making sure everything's protected." Protected. The word echoed inside my head. David hesitated. What if she argues she didn't understand what she signed? Richard actually laughed. She never read a single document. Silence. Then he added something that made my knees feel weak. She trusted me enough to sign whatever I put in front of her. I pressed one hand against the hallway wall. My heart pounded so loudly I worried they would hear it. David spoke again. Still, that doesn't sit right with me. Richard sighed impatiently. You worry too much. I'm just saying. Richard cut him off. Look, every transfer was legal. Transfer? What transfers? I had every important asset moved years ago. My breathing stopped. Years ago, David sounded uncomfortable. You really think she'll never find out? Richard answered without hesitation. Find out what? More laughter. She doesn't even know which bank holds most of our accounts. I felt heat rush into my face. He was right. I didn't. Not because I hadn't wanted to. Because every time I asked, he'd assured me everything was handled. David remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he asked, And the house? Richard leaned back in his chair. I made sure that couldn't become a problem either. I couldn't hear every word after that because one of them lowered his voice, but I heard enough. Enough to understand my marriage wasn't built on shared trust. It had been carefully managed, planned, controlled. I reached into my purse with shaking hands. Lauren had convinced me months earlier to learn how to use the voice recorder on my phone. You never know when you'll need to remember something, she'd joked after I complained about forgetting grocery lists. My fingers barely worked. Somehow I managed to open the recording app. I stood there silently recording the last few minutes of their conversation. The recording wasn't perfect. Some words were muffled. Others were clear enough to make my stomach turn. I heard Richard say, She'll never beat me. Then she signed every page. And finally, I planned this a long time ago. Those words were unmistakable. A floorboard creaked beneath my foot. Inside the office, the conversation stopped instantly. I didn't wait. I quietly backed away, slipped through the garage door, climbed into my car, and drove away before anyone saw me. I don't remember where I drove, only that I kept driving. At one point, I found myself sitting alone in a grocery store parking lot, nearly 20 miles from home. The recording played over and over through my car speakers. Each time I listened, another memory surfaced. The afternoon, Richard insisted we refinance the house. I've already gone over everything. The investment forms. Just sign here. The retirement paperwork. Our advisor recommended it. The insurance changes. This is only routine. Every signature, every smile, every reassuring touch on my shoulder. Had any of it been honest, or had every conversation simply been another step toward the moment I'd just overheard? By evening, I still couldn't make myself go home. Instead, I drove to a small park Lauren used to love as a child. I sat on a weathered wooden bench, watching families push children on swings. A little girl laughed as her father caught her after she jumped from the slide. The sound broke something inside me. I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. Not because of the money, not yet, because I realized I no longer knew which memories belonged to love and which belonged to manipulation. Had Richard ever trusted me, or had he only trusted that I would never question him? The thought was unbearable. I stayed there until the sun disappeared. When I finally returned home, Richard greeted me exactly as he always had. There you are? He smiled. Did you have fun shopping? I looked directly into his eyes. For nearly 30 years, I'd believed I could always tell when he was lying. Now I realized I had probably never known. It was fine, I answered quietly. You seem tired. I am. You should get some rest. He kissed my cheek. I forced myself not to pull away. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing. The man sleeping peacefully inches away from me had spent decades convincing me we were building a life together. Instead, he had apparently been building an escape plan. I stared into the darkness until nearly dawn. One question repeated itself again and again. If Richard had planned all this for years, how much else didn't I know? I had no answers. Only one shaky recording on my phone, and the terrifying feeling that the marriage I thought I understood had never truly existed. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had lived someone else's life. Richard kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, just like he always did. He grabbed his coffee, checked his phone, and gave me a quick smile. "Don't forget we have dinner with the Parkers on Friday," he said casually. I nodded. Of course. Then he walked out the door, closing it behind him, with the same quiet certainty he had carried for decades. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. The recording was still there. Proof that what I had heard wasn't a nightmare. Proof that my husband had been planning something behind my back for years. I played it again. She'll never beat me. She signed every page. I planned this a long time ago. Each sentence felt colder than the last. For a long time, I didn't move. I simply sat there holding my coffee as it slowly went cold, trying to understand what my next step should be. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers, to throw the recording in his face and watch him try to explain it. But another part of me, the part that had quietly endured for years, knew that would be a mistake. If Richard had truly planned all of this, then he was already several steps ahead. And confronting him without understanding the full picture would only give him the advantage. That thought frightened me more than anything else. For the first time in my life, I realized I couldn't rely on instinct alone. I needed help. Real help. Not from a friend, not from someone who would simply tell me everything would be okay. I needed someone who understood what people like Richard did and how to stop them. One name came to mind. Margaret Ellis. I hadn't thought about her in years, but I still remembered the first time I heard it. Nearly a decade earlier, we had attended a charity dinner with several of Richard's business associates. It had been one of those formal events where everyone smiled a little too much and spoke carefully about things that didn't really matter. At one point during dinner, another couple had joined our table. The husband, a contractor named Stephen Whitaker, had been unusually quiet. His wife, on the other hand, looked exhausted. I remember her mentioning something about a legal case, and that was when Richard leaned slightly closer to me and said very quietly, "That man made the worst mistake of his life." I glanced at him. What happened? He lowered his voice even further. He tried to hide assets during his divorce. And his wife's lawyer found everything. I remember asking, who was the lawyer? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the room as if searching for someone. Then he said a name I never forgot. Margaret Ellis. There had been something in his voice, not just irritation, something closer to respect, or maybe fear. "She's ruthless," he added. "I wouldn't want to go up against her." At the time, I had laughed. "Good thing you'll never need to," he smiled. "Exactly." Now sitting alone at my kitchen table, I realized something that made my heart race. If Richard had been afraid of Margaret Ellis all those years ago, then she might be the only person who could understand exactly what he had done to me. I didn't hesitate any longer. I picked up my phone and searched for her name. It took less than a minute to find her law firm. Her photo appeared on the website. She looked exactly how I imagined she would: calm, composed, and completely unshakable. Her bio listed decades of experience, high-profile cases, complex financial disputes, everything I didn't understand, everything I needed. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number. A receptionist answered. "Ellis and Monroe Law Offices. How can I help you?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I forced myself to breathe. "My name is Fiona Grant," I said quietly. "I need to schedule a consultation with Margaret Ellis." There was a brief pause. "Is this regarding a family law matter?" "Yes." Another pause. "I can schedule you for Thursday at 10 a.m. Will that work?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Please bring any relevant financial documents you have." Relevant documents? I almost laughed. "I'll bring what I can." When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. For the first time since overhearing that conversation, I wasn't completely alone. Thursday morning arrived faster than I expected. I told Richard I was meeting a friend for brunch. He didn't question it. Why would he? For nearly 30 years, I had never given him a reason to doubt me. Margaret Ellis's office was located in a quiet building downtown. It wasn't flashy. No towering glass walls, no dramatic entrance. Just a clean, professional space that felt grounded. The receptionist greeted me warmly and asked me to take a seat. My hands felt cold. I kept replaying the recording in my mind, wondering if I was overreacting, wondering if I was about to make a mistake. Then the door opened. "Mrs. Grant." I looked up. Margaret Ellis stood in the doorway. She was older than I expected, but there was nothing fragile about her. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, her eyes sharp in a way that made me feel like she already knew more than I had said. "Please come in." Her office was simple, organized, every file perfectly aligned. She gestured for me to sit. Then she took her place across from me, folding her hands gently on the desk. "Tell me what's going on." No small talk, no unnecessary introductions, just direct focus. For a moment, I didn't know where to begin. Then everything came out at once. The locked office, the missing documents, the conversation I overheard, the recording, the years of signing papers without reading them. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply listened, occasionally making small notes. When I finished, the room felt completely silent. I waited for her to say something reassuring, something simple. Instead, she asked a question I didn't expect. "How often did your husband ask you to sign documents?" I blinked. I don't know. Over the years, quite often." "Did he explain them in detail?" "Sometimes." "And when he didn't?" "I trusted him." She nodded slowly. "Did you ever attend meetings with your financial advisor?" "No." "Did you ever receive independent copies of your account statements?" I hesitated. "Not recently." She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Fiona M. going to ask you something important." Her tone shifted just enough to make me sit up straighter. "Did you ever feel uncomfortable asking questions about your finances?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer quickly, then stopped, because the truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit. "Yes," I said finally. She nodded again. "Good." "Good," I frowned. "I don't understand." Margaret folded her hands again. "Most people who come into my office think their case is about money." She paused. "It usually isn't." I felt my chest tighten. "Then what is it about?" She looked directly at me. "Control," The word landed heavily in the room. Financial control, she continued. Emotional control. Decision-making control. I stared at her. I thought this was about him hiding assets. It is, she said calmly. But that's only part of it. She reached for a blank legal pad and wrote something down. What you're describing isn't just a financial issue, Fiona. She slid the paper slightly toward me, though I couldn't read what she had written. It's a pattern. A pattern of what? She didn't hesitate. A pattern of long-term coercive control. The words made my stomach turn. I didn't even realize it was happening. That's usually the case. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me about your daily life. Small things. Who made decisions? Who handled communication? Who spoke for both of you in public? The questions felt strange, almost unrelated, but as I answered them, something shifted. Each response revealed another piece of something I had never fully examined. Richard choosing restaurants. Richard answering financial questions. Richard managing every conversation involving money. Richard deciding what I needed to know and what I didn't. By the time I finished, I felt exposed. Not judged, just seen. Margaret closed her notebook. I'm going to be very honest with you. I nodded. If your husband has done what you believe he has done, then yes, we may be able to challenge certain financial decisions. Hope flickered. But that's not where your strongest case is. The hope faltered slightly. Then where is it? She met my eyes again. In proving that those decisions were not made freely. I felt a chill run through me. You mean? I mean, she said carefully, that if we can demonstrate a consistent pattern of manipulation pressure and information control over time. She paused. Then everything changes. The room felt very still. For the first time, I began to understand something I had never considered before. This wasn't just about what Richard had taken. It was about how he had taken it, and that might be far more important than I ever imagined. I left Margaret Ellis's office with more questions than answers, but for the first time in weeks, my fear felt organized. Before everything had been overwhelming. A tangled mess of emotions, memories, and half-understood truths. But Margaret had done something I didn't even realize I needed. She had given my confusion a structure. This isn't about one moment, she had said before I left. It's about a pattern, and patterns can be proven. Those words stayed with me all the way home. A pattern. Not just one document, not just one conversation, not even just the recording on my phone. Everything. Every year. Every decision. Every silence. That night after Richard fell asleep, I quietly slipped out of bed and went into the hallway closet. I hadn't opened those boxes in years. Old photo albums, holiday decorations, stacks of papers I had once believed were too unimportant to keep organized. Now they felt like buried evidence. I pulled the first box onto the floor and opened it slowly. At the very top was a stack of old birthday cards. Most were from Lauren, a few were from friends, and several were from Richard. I almost set them aside. Then I remembered Margaret's question. Tell me about the small things. I opened one of Richard's cards from our 15th anniversary. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. Fiona, thank you for trusting me to take care of everything. I promise you'll never have to worry about a thing. I stared at the words longer than I should have. At the time, they had made me feel safe. Now they felt like a promise of control. I placed the card aside and reached for another. This one was from a few years later. You've always been so good at letting me handle the hard parts. That's why our life works. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Letting him handle the hard parts, or never being allowed to, I kept reading. Each card revealed the same pattern. Not cruel, not obvious, but consistent, always reinforcing the same idea. He handled everything. I trusted him. That was how our life worked. I set the cards aside and moved deeper into the box. Old folders, receipts, school paperwork from Lauren's childhood. Then I found something I hadn't expected, a small spiral notebook. My handwriting. I sat down on the floor and opened it carefully. It was a journal, not a daily one, just occasional entries, thoughts I had written during moments when something felt off. I had forgotten it even existed. The first entry I read was from nearly 20 years earlier. Richard got irritated when I asked about the mortgage today. I don't understand why it upset him. Maybe I asked at a bad time. I turned the page. Another entry. He said I worry too much about money. I don't think I worry. I just want to understand. Another. I tried to read the paperwork today, but gave up. It's too complicated. He says it's better if I don't stress over it. I stopped reading for a moment. My hands were shaking. These weren't new thoughts. They weren't things I had recently realized. I had felt them years ago. I had noticed the discomfort. I had questioned it. And then I had dismissed it. Page after page told the same story. Small concerns, quick reassurances, followed by my own decision to trust him instead of questioning further. I closed the notebook slowly. That's when it truly hit me. This wasn't just something that had happened to me recently. It had been happening for decades. Quietly, patiently, consistently. The next morning, I returned to Margaret's office with everything I could carry. The journal, the cards, old folders, even things I wasn't sure mattered. Margaret didn't react immediately. She simply began sorting through everything with calm precision. She read the journal carefully, then the cards, then the scattered documents. Every now and then she made a note. After nearly an hour, she finally looked up at me. "This is exactly what we need." I blinked. "This?" I gestured toward the messy stack of personal items. "I thought you were looking for financial documents." "We are," she said. "But this is just as important." She tapped the journal gently. "This shows awareness. I don't understand." You questioned things, she explained. You noticed inconsistencies. You felt discomfort. I nodded slowly. "Yes, but I ignored it." "That's not a weakness," she said calmly. "It's part of the pattern." She leaned back slightly. Coercive control often works by creating confusion followed by reassurance. Her words felt uncomfortably accurate. "You question something," she continued. "Then you're made to feel like you're overreacting. So you stop questioning." I felt my throat tighten. That's exactly what happened. "I know." She began organizing the items into separate piles. "Now we need to build a timeline." "A timeline?" "Yes." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and drew a long horizontal line across it. "This represents your marriage." Then she began marking points along it. "Here's when you left your job. Here's when your financial involvement decreased. Here's when documents became more frequent. Here's when access to information became limited." She paused and looked at me. "Do you see what this is forming?" I stared at the page. At first, it looked like random notes. Then slowly, something else emerged. A progression. Not sudden, not chaotic, but deliberate. "It's gradual," I said. Exactly. She circled several points. This is what we present. I felt a mixture of relief and fear. Will it be enough? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another file. This is where things become more complex. She opened it and showed me something I didn't recognize. Bank records, not ours, or at least not ones I had ever seen. Where did you get those? I asked. Preliminary research, she said. My heart started racing. What is it? These are transfers, she explained. Large ones. I leaned forward. I don't recognize any of this. That's the point. She tapped one line. These transactions don't match the financial picture your husband has presented. My stomach dropped. You mean he moved money? Possibly. The word possibly didn't comfort me. How long? She looked at me carefully. Years. I sat back in my chair trying to process it. How is that even possible? It's not uncommon, she said calmly, especially when one spouse has full control over financial information. I felt anger rising for the first time. Not confusion, not fear. Anger. He planned this, I said quietly. Margaret didn't argue. He may have. I looked down at my hands. They thought I'd never find out. She nodded slightly. That was likely the assumption. For a moment, the room felt very still. Then she spoke again. Fiona, I need you to understand something. I looked up. This process will not be easy. I know. He will fight back. I know. He will try to control the narrative. That party made my chest tighten. He already has. I looked up. This process will not be easy. I know. He will fight back. I know. He will try to control the narrative. That part made my chest tighten. He already has. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Then we make sure the truth is stronger. I took a slow breath. For the first time since all of this began, I felt something steady inside me. Not fear, not doubt, something else, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Resolve. Tell me what I need to do, I said. Margaret nodded once. We build the full picture. And then she met my eyes. Then we show exactly how it was built. As I left her office that day, I realized something that changed everything. Richard hadn't just underestimated me. He had misunderstood me. Because the woman who once signed papers without reading them was no longer the woman walking out of that office. If I had believed that hiring Margaret Ellis would immediately make everything easier, I was wrong. The moment Richard realized I was no longer playing the role he had assigned me, everything changed. It started subtly. 3 days after my second meeting with Margaret, I tried to use our joint checking account to pay a routine utility bill. The transaction was declined. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. I checked the balance. There was money there. Plenty of it. I tried again. Declined. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I called the bank. After a few minutes of polite hold music, a representative finally came on the line. I'm sorry, Mrs. Grant, she said carefully, but there have been recent changes to the account authorization. What kind of changes? I'm not able to provide full details, but access permissions have been modified. Modified by who? There was a pause. By the primary account holder. My hand tightened around the phone. That's my husband. Yes, ma'am. I swallowed hard. So I no longer have access to my own account? I'm afraid your authorization level has been limited. Limited? The word echoed in my mind. Limited to what you can view certain information, but you are no longer authorized to initiate transactions. I hung up slowly. For a moment, I just stood in the kitchen staring at nothing. Then I picked up my phone and called Margaret. "He's already moving," she said after I explained what happened. "What does that mean?" "It means he knows you're no longer passive." My stomach tightened. "Is this legal?" "Possibly," she said calmly, "depending on how the accounts were structured." "So he can just cut me off?" "For now," she replied. "Yes." I felt anger rising. "He's trying to control me again." "Yes," she said. "And we expected that." Expected. That word stopped me. "You knew this would happen." "I knew something like this would happen," she corrected. "People who rely on control rarely give it up quietly." I leaned against the counter. "What do I do?" "You stay calm," she said firmly. "And you do not react emotionally in front of him." "That's going to be difficult." "I know," she said. "But right now, every reaction you give him becomes information he can use." Her words forced me to pause. Information. That was exactly what Richard had been controlling for years, and now I needed to be careful about what I revealed. That evening when Richard came home, he acted as though nothing had changed. He hung his jacket by the door, poured himself a drink, asked about my day. Normal. Completely normal. I studied his face as he spoke. There was no sign of guilt, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that he had just quietly cut me off from my own finances. "Did you take care of the electric bill?" he asked casually. The question felt deliberate. I met his eyes. "I tried." He raised an eyebrow. "Tried. The card didn't go through." He took a sip of his drink. "That's strange." "Is it?" Our eyes held for a moment longer than usual. Then he smiled. "I'll look into it." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just a calm promise to look into it. As if I hadn't just been removed from the account entirely. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood something Margaret had been trying to tell me. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. And Richard wasn't going to let go of it without a fight. The next morning, things escalated. I received a call from Lauren. Her voice sounded tense. "Mom, what's going on?" My heart dropped. "What do you mean?" "Dad called me last night." "Of course he did. What did he say?" She hesitated. "He said you've been acting strange." A bitter taste filled my mouth. Strange? He said you're confused about things, that you've been misunderstanding financial decisions. I closed my eyes. "And you believe him?" "I don't know what to believe," she admitted. "You haven't told me anything." I sat down slowly. "I didn't want to worry you." "Mom, I'm already worried." There was a long pause. "I need to see you," she said finally. "Tonight?" "Yes." "Okay," I agreed. After I hung up, I called Margaret again. "He's isolating you," she said immediately. "What?" "He's controlling the narrative," she explained, "positioning himself as reasonable and you as unstable." My chest tightened. "That's exactly what he's doing." "I know," she said. "It's a common strategy. It's working," I whispered. "Not if we stay ahead of it." I took a deep breath. "What do I say to Lauren?" "The truth," she said simply, but carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't overwhelm her with everything at once. You give her enough to understand, but not so much that she shuts down." I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. "I can do that." "Good," she said. "And Fiona, it means you don't overwhelm her with everything at once. You give her enough to understand, but not so much that she shuts down. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. I can do that. Good, she said. And Fiona? Yes. Do not let him make you doubt yourself. Her words stayed with me all afternoon. When Lauren arrived that evening, I could see the tension in her face immediately. She hugged me tightly. Mom, you look tired. I am. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent years believing everything in my life was secure. Lauren didn't wait long. Dad says you're hinking about divorce. I nodded. I am. The same table where I had spent years believing everything in my life was secure. Lauren didn't wait long. Dad says you're thinking about divorce. I nodded. I am. Her eyes widened. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't fully understand it myself yet. She studied my face. What's going on? I took a deep breath. Then I told her. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. I told her about the locked office, the missing documents, the conversation I overheard, the recording. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something closer to fear. Are you serious? She whispered. I wish I wasn't. Dad wouldn't. She stopped herself. Then she asked quietly, Do you have proof? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed play. The recording filled the room. Richard's voice, calm, confident, certain. She'll never beat me. Lauren covered her mouth. She signed every page. Tears filled her eyes. I planned this a long time ago. The recording ended. Silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Lauren shook her head slowly. I don't understand. Neither did I said. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. How long has this been happening? I swallowed hard. Longer than I realized. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I feel like I don't even know him. I reached across the table and took her hand. I know. She squeezed my hand tightly. What are you going to do? I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. I'm going to fight him. Her grip tightened. Good. The words surprised me. She wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. Because if that's true, her voice steadied, then he's not the man I thought he was. I felt something shift between us in that moment, not just understanding, alignment. For the first time, I wasn't standing alone against Richard, but I also knew something else. Richard wasn't finished, not even close, because if there was one thing I had learned about him after all these years, it was this: he never gave up control without trying to take something in return. And whatever his next move was going to be, it wouldn't be small. The days after Lauren heard the recording were some of the most emotionally fragile I had ever experienced. Not because I doubted what I had heard, but because I was watching my daughter slowly come to terms with something that had taken me nearly 30 years to understand. At first, she tried to hold on to the version of Richard she had always known. He's always been responsible, she said one afternoon while we sat together on my couch. I know, I replied gently. He took care of everything. I nodded. Yes. She looked at me, her brow furrowed. So, how does someone like that become? She hesitated, searching for the right word. This I didn't answer immediately, because I didn't have a simple explanation. I don't think he became anything, I said quietly. I think he always was. That realization hung in the air between us. Lauren looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about things from when I was younger, she said. Like what? She hesitated. Then she spoke slowly, as if each memory surprised her. Do you remember when I was in middle school and you wanted to go back to work part-time? I blinked. I remember Dad saying it didn't make sense financially, she continued. That it would cost more in childcare and transportation than you'd earn. I felt a chill. That sounds like something he would say. Lauren nodded, but I also remember you being excited about it before that. I searched my memory. She was right. I had been excited. I had even applied for a part-time position at the library. Then Richard had explained why it wasn't practical, and I had accepted it. I forgot about that, I admitted. Lauren looked at me carefully. I don't think you forgot, she said. I think you let it go. Her words stung. Not because they were harsh, because they were true. Over the next few days, Lauren began remembering more. Little things, small moments that had never seemed important before. Dad always answered for you, she said one evening. What do you mean? When people asked questions about money or decisions, she explained. You'd start to answer and he'd jump in. I thought about it and realized she was right. At the time, I had interpreted it as confidence. Now I saw it differently. What else do you remember? I asked. She hesitated again. Then her voice dropped slightly. There was this one time, I must have been about 16. I watched her closely. You and Dad were arguing in the kitchen. My chest tightened. I didn't know you heard that. I wasn't supposed to, she said. But I did. What were we arguing about? She took a breath. You wanted to look at some paperwork. My mind raced, and Dad kept telling you it wasn't necessary. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. What did I say? Lauren's eyes filled with emotion. You said, I just want to understand. The words hit me like a wave. Because I remembered that. Not clearly, but enough. And what did he say? I asked quietly. She swallowed. He said, You don't need to understand everything, Fiona. That's why you have me. Silence filled the room. I closed my eyes. Hearing those words again through Lauren's memory felt different. Colder, sharper. Lauren wiped her eyes. I didn't think anything of it at the time, she whispered. I thought that's just how marriage worked. I reached for her hand. So did I. We sat there for a long moment, both of us quietly reconstructing a past that suddenly looked very different. Then Lauren said something that changed everything. There's something else. I looked up. What is it? She stood up and walked toward the hallway. I need to get my phone. When she returned, she held it tightly in her hand. I don't even know if this still exists, she said, her voice unsteady. What are you looking for? A voicemail. My heart skipped. From who? She hesitated. From Dad. The room seemed to grow smaller. Years ago, she said, I think I saved it because it felt strange. She scrolled through her phone, her fingers moving quickly but carefully. Minutes passed. Then suddenly she stopped. Her eyes widened. I found it. I felt my breath catch. Play it. She hesitated for a second, then pressed the screen. The sound of Richard's voice filled the room. Calm, measured, controlled. Fiona, I need you to sign the documents I left on the table. Lauren and I exchanged a quick glance. This isn't complicated. His voice continued. It's just a formality. Fiona, I need you to sign the documents I left on the table. Lauren and I exchanged a quick glance. This isn't complicated. His voice continued. It's just a formality. My chest tightened. Please don't start asking questions again. He added, his tone slightly sharper. We've already gone over this. I felt my stomach drop. I don't have time to explain everything twice, he said. Just trust me and sign where I marked. The voicemail ended. Silence. Lauren stared at me. Mom, I couldn't speak. Because that voicemail, it wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation. Confirmation of something I had been trying to piece together. The tone, the language, the pattern, it was all there. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Coercive control often works by creating confusion followed by reassurance. I looked at Lauren. Do you still have the original file? Yes. Don't delete it. I won't. I stood up slowly. We need to show this to Margaret. Lauren nodded immediately. The next morning, we sat across from Margaret Ellis again. This time, Lauren was beside me. Margaret listened to the voicemail without interrupting. Her expression didn't change, but I could see the intensity in her eyes. When it ended, she set her pen down carefully. How long ago was this, she asked. Lauren answered. I was about 16, so maybe 17 years ago. Margaret nodded. Do you have the original file with metadata? Lauren blinked. I think so. Good, Margaret said. That's important. She turned to me. This is significant. I felt my pulse quicken. Why? Because it captures tone, language, and pressure in real time, she explained. She tapped the desk lightly. It's not just what he said, it's how he said it. Lauren leaned forward. Is it enough to prove something? Margaret gave a small, measured nod. It strengthens the pattern. She reached for her notes and began writing. We now have, she counted quietly, a recorded conversation with an accountant, a historical voicemail demonstrating pressure, a personal journal document in pressure, a personal journal document in G, repeated discomfort, and corroborating testimony from you, she added, glancing at Lauren. Lauren sat up straighter. You think I might have to testify? Margaret met her eyes. It's possible, G repeated discomfort. And corroborating testimony from you? She added, glancing at Lauren. Lauren sat up straighter. You think I might have to testify? Margaret met her eyes. It's possible. Lauren didn't hesitate. I will. The certainty in her voice surprised me and moved me. Margaret nodded once. Good. Then she turned back to me. Fiona, this is exactly what we needed. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something I had been holding back. Hope. Real hope. Not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded in something tangible. Evidence. Truth. Pattern. But Margaret wasn't finished. There's still more we need to uncover, she said. What else? She leaned forward slightly. The financial structure behind all of this? My stomach tightened. You mean the hidden accounts? Yes. She paused. And I believe we're only seeing the surface. A chill ran through me. What does that mean? It means, she said carefully, that if your husband has been this deliberate about control. She held my gaze. Then it's very unlikely he stopped at just one level. The room felt very still. Lauren looked at me. I looked back at her. We both understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was something much bigger. And whatever Richard had built behind the scenes, we were only just beginning to see it. Margaret was right. We had only been looking at the surface. The deeper we dug, the more I realized that Richard hadn't just hidden money. He had hidden entire pieces of our life. The next phase of the investigation didn't involve me searching through closets or remembering old conversations. It involved people I had never met. Forensic accountants, specialists who spoke a language I barely understood, and yet every word they said felt like it was slowly rewriting the story of my marriage. I sat in Margaret's office as one of them, a quiet man named Thomas Reed, spread out several documents across the table. "These are transactional patterns," he explained, pointing to a series of numbers and dates. I leaned forward, trying to follow. "They don't look unusual at first," he continued, "but when you examine them over time, they reveal consistency." Margaret nodded. "That's what we're interested in." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "These transfers begin about 12 years ago." 12 years? I felt my chest tighten. "That long?" I asked. He glanced at me briefly. "Yes." He tapped one of the pages. "Small amounts at first, nothing that would raise concern." "How small?" I asked. "A few $1,000s at a time," I swallowed. "That's not small to me?" He gave a polite nod. "I understand, but in the context of larger financial portfolios, it can go unnoticed." My stomach turned. "It can go unnoticed." My stomach turned D. "That was intentional," I said quietly. Margaret didn't interrupt. Thomas continued. "Over time, the amounts increase, still not extreme, but consistent." He flipped to another page. "Eventually, we start seeing larger transfers. D." "That was intentional," I said quietly. Margaret didn't interrupt. Thomas continued. "Over time, the amounts increase, still not extreme, but consistent." He flipped to another page. "Eventually, we start seeing larger transfers." "How large?" Margaret asked. "6 figures." The room went completely silent. I felt like the air had been pulled out of my lungs. "6 figures," I repeated. Thomas nodded. "Yes." I stared at the documents, numbers I had never seen, accounts I didn't recognize, transactions I had never approved. Where did the money go? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas exchanged a brief glance with Margaret. Then he answered, "To a corporate entity." My mind struggled to keep up. What kind of entity? A shell company? The words sounded distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. "Owned by who?" I asked. Thomas hesitated. "That's where things become more interesting." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Go on." Thomas slid another document toward us. "This company is registered under the name Michael Grant." My heart dropped. "Michael? That's your husband's brother, correct?" Margaret asked. I nodded slowly. Yes. Michael had always been a quiet presence in our lives. He lived in another state, visited occasionally during holidays, never particularly close to me, but not suspicious either. At least, not until now. "You're saying Richard transferred money to his brother?" I asked. "Indirectly," Thomas clarified. "Through this company." I shook my head. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does, if the goal is concealment," Margaret said calmly. I looked at her. "You think Michael knew that's what we need to determine?" I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. All these years they were working together? Possibly, she said carefully. Or Michael may have been used without fully understanding the implications. I clenched my hands together. Either way, he benefited. Thomas nodded. The funds didn't disappear. They were relocated. Relocated. Such a simple word for something that felt like betrayal. How much? I asked. Thomas looked down at his notes. Based on what we've identified so far, several million. The number hit me harder than anything else. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. Years. Decades. Every sacrifice. Every moment I had trusted him, converted into numbers I had never even known existed. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady myself. This wasn't just preparation for a divorce, I said slowly. Margaret shook her head. No, this was something else. Yes, I looked at her. What kind of person does this? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a different question. What kind of person believes they will never be questioned? The answer was obvious. Richard. For the rest of that meeting, the details continued to unfold. More accounts, more transfers, more patterns, each one carefully structured to look ordinary, each one designed to avoid attention. And all of it built on one assumption that I would never look closely enough to see it. When I left Margaret's office that day, the world felt different. Not just my marriage. Everything. Because I realized something that had never occurred to me before. Richard hadn't just underestimated me. He had erased me. From decisions, from knowledge, from ownership, from everything that mattered. And now that I was finally seeing the full picture, I understood why he had been so confident. Why he had smiled when he told me I would never win. Because from his perspective, there was nothing left for me to fight for. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the walls of the house I had lived in for years. The house I had decorated, cleaned, filled with memories. And yet, I had no idea if it even legally belonged to me. The thought made my chest ache. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old photos, family vacations, birthday parties, holiday dinners, Richard smiling, Lauren laughing, me standing beside them, believing I was part of something solid, something shared. Now I saw it differently, like I had been standing inside a carefully constructed illusion. There was a knock at the door. I stood up slowly and opened it. Lauren. She looked at me immediately, reading my expression. What happened? I stepped aside to let her in. We found something. She sat down, her eyes searching mine. What kind of something? I hesitated. Then I told her. Not every detail, but enough. The transfers, the company, Michael's name. Her face changed with every word. No, she whispered. That can't be real. I wish it wasn't. She stood up and began pacing. So Dad has been moving money for years, yes, and Uncle Michael is involved. We don't know how much he knew. She stopped pacing and looked at me. How do you even come back from something like this? I didn't answer right away. Because I didn't know? Not fully. But I did know one thing. You don't come back from it, I said quietly. You move forward. She stared at me. And what does that look like? I took a deep breath. It looks like the truth. She nodded slowly. And Dad? I met her eyes. He's going to have to face it. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel afraid when I said that. Not because I believed it would be easy, but because I finally understood something I hadn't before. Richard's greatest strength had always been control. Control of information. Control of perception. Control of the story. But now, the story was no longer his alone, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, I had something he couldn't control anymore. The truth. The first time I saw Richard lose control, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. And that made it even more unsettling. Margaret had prepared me for the next phase of the process depositions. I didn't fully understand what that meant at first. In my mind, I imagined a courtroom, judges, witnesses, raised voices. But this was quieter, more controlled, more dangerous. "This is where we begin dismantling him," Margaret said before the first session. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "As long as we stay disciplined." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we don't rush," she said. "We don't accuse, we let him speak." I frowned slightly. "That sounds backwards." She gave a small, knowing smile. "It only feels that way if you don't understand what he's been relying on." "And what is that?" She didn't hesitate. "Consistency." The word caught my attention. "He believes his story is airtight," she continued, "that everything he said over the years aligns perfectly. And it doesn't." She leaned forward slightly. "No one maintains perfect consistency over decades, not when they're hiding something." I took a slow breath. "So we're waiting for him to make a mistake." "Exactly." The first deposition took place in a quiet conference room. No courtroom, no audience. Just a long table, a court reporter, Richard's attorney, Margaret and me. And Richard. He walked in wearing the same confident expression I had seen so many times before. Calm, collected, certain. He glanced at me briefly, then took his seat without saying a word. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old instinct, the instinct to avoid conflict, to keep things smooth. But then I remembered the recording, the transfers, the years, and that instinct disappeared. The questioning began. At first, Margaret's approach surprised me. She didn't start with accusations. She didn't mention hidden accounts or missing assets. Instead, she asked simple questions. Routine ones. "Mr. Grant, can you describe how financial decisions were handled in your marriage?" Richard answered smoothly. "I managed most of the financial responsibilities. And your wife?" "She trusted me to do that." His tone was steady, confident, exactly as Margaret had expected. "And was that arrangement mutual?" she asked. "Yes." "Did Mrs. Grant ever express concerns about not being involved?" Richard shook his head. "No." I felt a sharp reaction rise inside me. But I stayed quiet. Margaret didn't react either. She simply nodded and continued. "Did Mrs. Grant ever request access to financial documents?" "No." The lie was so easy, so immediate, it almost impressed me. Margaret flipped through her notes. "Do you recall a discussion regarding the mortgage approximately 17 years ago?" Richard paused, just for a fraction of a second. Then he answered, "No." That pause didn't escape Margaret. "Are you certain?" "Yes." She nodded again. Then she moved on. The questions continued like that for nearly an hour. Simple, measured, unremarkable. And yet I could feel something shifting. Not in what Richard was saying, but in how he was saying it. At first his answers were immediate, effortless. But as time passed, small changes appeared. A slight hesitation, a longer pause, a subtle tightening of his jaw, barely noticeable. Unless you were watching closely. Margaret was. At one point, she asked a question that seemed almost trivial. "Mr. Grant, did you ever ask your wife to sign documents without fully explaining their contents?" Richard smiled slightly. "Of course not." The confidence in his voice was absolute. Margaret nodded. Then she reached into her folder. And yet she said calmly, "We have evidence suggesting otherwise." For the first time, Richard's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a flicker, a moment of recalibration. "What evidence?" his attorney asked quickly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Richard. "Mr. Grant, do you recall leaving a voicemail instructing your wife to sign documents?" Silence. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. I don't recall the specifics of every conversation, he said carefully. Margaret slid a document across the table. We have a recording. The room felt suddenly smaller. Richard didn't touch the paper. But I saw something in his eyes. Recognition. That doesn't prove anything, his attorney said quickly. Margaret didn't argue. Of course, she said calmly. Which is why we're simply establishing a pattern. Pattern? The word landed exactly where it needed to. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. The first visible sign of discomfort. The questioning continued. Now Margaret began introducing small inconsistencies. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough. Earlier you stated that your wife never expressed concern about financial matters. That's correct. And yet we have documentation indicating she did. I'm not aware of that. Of course, Margaret said, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Each exchange was subtle, measured, but the effect was building. Slowly, relentlessly. By the time the deposition ended, Richard's confidence hadn't collapsed. Not yet, but it had cracked, and I saw it. In the way he avoided eye contact. In the way his answers became slightly less certain. In the way his composure required effort instead of coming naturally. After the session, I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. Adrenaline. Margaret joined me a few moments later. You did well, she said. I didn't say anything. Exactly. I looked at her. He lied. Yes, so why didn't you call him out directly? She smiled slightly. Because this isn't about one lie, I understood immediately. It's about the pattern. She nodded. Now he's committed to a version of events. And that's good. It's necessary, she said. Because once someone commits, she paused. They have to maintain it. I felt a slow realization settle in. And that's where the cracks appear. Exactly. I looked back toward the building, where Richard still sat inside. For the first time, I didn't see him as untouchable. I saw him as something else. Someone who had built a system so carefully that he believed it couldn't fail. But systems fail, especially when they rely on secrecy. And now, there was no more secrecy. There was only time. Time for the truth to surface. Time for the contradictions to grow. Time for the story he had controlled for decades to begin slipping out of his hands. As we walked away, Margaret spoke again. This was only the beginning. I nodded. I know. And Fiona. Yes, he's going to push harder now. I felt a calm settle over me. Let him. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what Richard might do next. I was waiting for it. If the deposition had cracked Richard's confidence, the next development shattered something much deeper. It came from someone I had never expected. Margaret called me early one morning. Her tone was calm, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. We have a new witness, she said. I sat up straighter in my chair. Who? A former bank manager. My mind struggled to connect the dots. From one of our accounts? Yes, she said. From several years ago. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Why now? Because he's retiring, she explained, and he reviewed some of his old records before stepping away. I felt my pulse quicken. And he remembered something. Yes. What? She paused briefly. He remembered your husband. That didn't surprise me. Richard had handled all of our financial dealings. He was a regular client, and he remembered something. Yes? What? She paused briefly. He remembered your husband. That didn't surprise me. Richard had handled all of our financial dealings. He was a regular client, Margaret continued. Very particular, very involved. That sounded exactly like Richard. But that's not why this matters, she added. I leaned forward slightly. Then why does it matter, dealings? He was a regular client, Margaret continued. Very particular, very involved. That sounded exactly like Richard. But that's not why this matters, she added. I leaned forward slightly. Then why does it matter? Because of what he insisted on. I held my breath. What did he insist on? Margaret's voice was steady. That you never attend meetings. The words landed harder than I expected. He didn't want me there, I asked quietly. No, she said, and according to the witness, he made that very clear. A chill ran through me. That's not normal, is it? No, Margaret replied. It isn't. I felt something shift inside me. Another piece falling into place. Another pattern revealing itself. When do we meet him? I asked. This afternoon, the meeting took place in a small office just outside the city. The man we met, Harold Whitman, was in his late 60s, soft-spoken, methodical, the kind of person who paid attention to details others might overlook. He shook my hand gently. Mrs. Grant, he said, it's nice to meet you. I forced a small smile. I wish it were under different circumstances. He nodded. I understand. We sat down together, Margaret beside me. Harold adjusted his glasses and opened a worn leather folder. I kept notes, he said. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of notes? Personal ones, he explained. Nothing official, just observations I made during meetings. He flipped through the pages carefully. I've always believed that details matter, he added. I felt my hands grow cold. What did you notice? I asked. He looked at me briefly, then back at his notes. Your husband was very specific. Specific how he preferred to meet alone. I swallowed. That doesn't seem unusual? No, Harold agreed, but he insisted on it. My chest tightened. He didn't want you present, Harold continued, even when it would have been appropriate. Did you ever suggest it? Margaret asked. Yes, Harold said. Several times. And his response, Harold flipped to a particular page. I wrote it down, he said. He adjusted his glasses again and read aloud. Client states, my wife doesn't need to be involved. I handle everything. The words echoed in the room. I felt like I was hearing a familiar script. Because I was. Margaret nodded slightly. Anything else? Harold hesitated. Then he turned another page. There was one meeting that stood out. I leaned forward. Why? He looked directly at me. Because your husband became insistent. My stomach dropped. About what? About restructuring account ownership. I felt my breath catch. What kind of restructuring? Harold chose his words carefully. Shifting primary control. To him. Yes. I closed my eyes briefly. Was I mentioned? Harold nodded. Yes. My chest tightened. What did he say? Harold glanced at his notes again. He said it would be simpler if everything were in his name. I felt a wave of anger rise. Simpler for who Harold didn't answer. He didn't need to. Margaret spoke instead. Did he explain why? Harold shook his head. No. But he emphasized urgency. Urgency, I repeated. Yes, Harold said. He wanted it done quickly. Margaret exchanged a brief glance with me. We both understood what that meant. Planning, timing, execution. How long ago was this? Margaret asked. Harold checked his notes. Approximately 11 years. 11 years. The timeline aligned perfectly. Margaret leaned back slightly. Mr. Whitman, did anything else about these meetings stand out to you? He hesitated again. Then he said something that made my entire body go still. Yes. What Margaret asked. Harold looked at me carefully. Your husband didn't just manage finances. He hesitated again. Then he said something that made my entire body go still. Yes. What Margaret asked. Harold looked at me carefully. Your husband didn't just manage finances. My heart began to pound. What do you mean? He chose his words slowly. He managed perception. The room fell silent. He was very aware of how things looked. Harold continued. What was documented? What wasn't? I felt a chill run through me. You're saying he was careful, I said. I'm saying he was intentional. Intentional. The words settled heavily in my mind. Margaret closed her notebook slowly. This is extremely helpful, she said. Harold nodded. I thought it might be. As we left the office, I felt something shift inside me again. Not just anger, not just betrayal. Understanding, clearer than it had ever been. This wasn't random, I said quietly. Margaret glanced at me. No, this wasn't even just preparation. No, she agreed. This was strategy. She nodded. Yes. I stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. He built this. Yes. Step by step. Yes. I felt my chest tighten, and he thought no one would ever question it. Margaret's expression remained calm. Until now. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I truly understood something that had been building throughout this entire process. Richard hadn't just underestimated me. He had relied on my silence, on my trust, on my willingness to believe. But now every piece of evidence told a different story. A story he hadn't planned for. A story he hadn't planned for. A story he couldn't control. As we walked back to the car, Margaret spoke again. This changes the strength of our case significantly. I nodded. I can see why. But it also changes his position, she added. How couldn't control? As we walked back to the car, Margaret spoke again. This changes the strength of our case significantly. I nodded. I can see why. But it also changes his position, she added. How? He knows we're getting closer. I felt a quiet determination settle inside me. Good. She looked at me. You're not afraid. I thought about that for a moment. Then I shook my head. No. Because fear had been part of my life for too long. Quiet, unspoken, unquestioned. And now it was gone. Replaced by something stronger, something steadier, something that didn't rely on trust in someone else, but on belief in myself. He's running out of places to hide, I said. Margaret gave a small approving nod. Yes. And for the first time, I believed it. By the time we entered the courtroom, I no longer felt like the same woman who had once signed documents without reading them. But nothing, not Margaret's preparation, not the evidence, not even the depositions could fully prepare me for what it felt like to face Richard there. Because this time, there was no distance, no quiet conference room, no polite, controlled environment. This was public. This was final. And this was where everything he had built would either hold or collapse. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just a space where truth had nowhere to hide. Richard sat across the room with his attorney, looking exactly as he always had. Composed, confident, untouched. If someone had walked in without knowing anything, they would have believed him immediately. That was his strength. Always had been. Margaret leaned slightly toward me. "Remember," she said quietly, "this is not about how he appears." I nodded. "It's about what we can prove." "Exactly." The proceedings began slowly. Formalities, introductions, procedural details that felt distant compared to what I knew was coming. Then Margaret stood, and everything changed. She didn't start with accusations. She didn't begin with the hidden money. Instead, she told a story, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, carefully. "This case," she began, "is not simply about financial disagreement." Her voice carried across the room with quiet authority. "It is about a pattern. Pattern. The word had followed me through every stage of this process, and now it was at the center of everything." Margaret walked slowly, deliberately as she spoke. A pattern of control, a pattern of information restriction, a pattern of decision-making that systematically excluded one spouse from understanding her own financial reality. I felt my chest tighten, because she wasn't just describing evidence. She was describing my life. She began laying it out piece by piece. The journal, the cards, the voicemail, the deposition inconsistencies. Each one presented not as isolated incidents, but as connected points in a single continuous line. I watched Richard carefully as she spoke. At first, he remained still, calm, unbothered. But then she introduced the financial evidence, and that was when something changed. "These records," Margaret said, holding up a document, "demonstrate a consistent pattern of asset transfers over more than a decade." Richard shifted slightly in his seat. "Barely noticeable. Unless you were watching for it." "I was." "These transfers," she continued, "were structured to avoid detection. Routed through a corporate entity not disclosed to Mrs. Grant. The room felt heavier, denser. And that entity, she added, is linked directly to the defendant's immediate family, Michael." I saw Richard's jaw tighten. Margaret didn't pause. She moved forward, relentless, precise. Then came Lauren's testimony. I held my breath as she took the stand. She looked nervous, but determined, stronger than I had ever seen her. Her voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. She spoke about her childhood, about the conversations she overheard, about the way Richard always answered for me, about the voicemail. When the recording was played in court, the silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, because for the first time, Richard's voice was no longer controlled by him. It was evidence, it was truth, and it was undeniable. I glanced at him. He wasn't smiling anymore. Then came the bank manager, Harold Whitman. He spoke calmly, clearly, without exaggeration, describing meetings, requests, insistence, control, each word adding weight to the pattern Margaret had built. And then it was my turn. I hadn't been afraid before that moment, not truly. But as I walked to the stand, something inside me shifted. Because this wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was about my voice. For nearly 30 years, I had trusted someone else to speak for me, to decide for me, to explain things for me. And now I had to do it myself. I sat down, took a breath, and began. "I trusted my husband," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I believed that's what a good marriage required. I could feel every eye in the room. But over time, I stopped asking questions. I paused, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted them to understand. I didn't stop because I didn't care. I continued. I stopped because every time I asked, I was made to feel like I shouldn't. I glanced at Richard. He was watching me now, intently, no longer distant, no longer detached. This wasn't one moment, I said. It wasn't one decision. I swallowed. It was years, years. The word echoed in the courtroom. Years of being told not to worry. Years of being told everything was handled. Years of signing documents I didn't understand because I trusted the person asking me to sign them. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't stop. And I didn't realize what was happening until it was almost too late. The silence that followed felt different this time. Not heavy, not tense, but real. Because for the first time, I wasn't being spoken for. I was speaking. When I stepped down from the stand, my legs felt unsteady, but my mind was clear. Margaret gave me a small nod as I returned to my seat. Then it was Richard's turn. He stood with the same composure he had always carried, the same confidence, the same control. But something was different, subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. He wasn't as certain anymore. His testimony began smoothly, rehearsed, measured. He denied wrongdoing, explained decisions, framed everything as logical, reasonable, necessary. But then Margaret began her cross-examination, and that was when everything unraveled. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece. You stated earlier that your wife never requested financial information. Yes, and yet we have documentation indicating otherwise. I'm not aware of that. And the voicemail? That was taken out of context. Margaret didn't argue. She simply moved forward. You also stated that all financial decisions were made transparently. Yes. Then can you explain these transfers? She placed the documents in front of him. For the first time, he hesitated. A real hesitation. Not a controlled pause, but a break, a crack. They were business-related, he said. Through your brother's company? Another pause. Yes. Why was your wife not informed? Silence. Richard's jaw tightened. It wasn't necessary. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Not necessary or not convenient. That was when it happened. Not a shout, not an outburst, just a shift. A loss of control so small that most people might have missed it. But I didn't, because I had lived with him long enough to recognize it. His voice changed, sharpened. Everything I did was for this family, he said. The first hint of emotion. The first sign of strain. Margaret didn't raise her voice, didn't react. She simply asked one more question. Then why was your wife excluded from understanding it? Richard didn't answer immediately. And in that moment, the first sign of strain. Margaret didn't raise her voice, didn't react. She simply asked one more question. Then why was your wife excluded from understanding it? Richard didn't answer immediately, and in that moment, the silence said everything. Because for the first time, he didn't have control over the story anymore, and everyone in that room could see it. After the courtroom session where Richard finally hesitated, everything shifted. Not publicly, not immediately, but behind the scenes, something had changed. Margaret saw it before I did. He's going to make a move. She told me the very next morning. What kind of move? A controlled one, she said. Something that looks reasonable. I frowned. Reasonable? Yes, she replied, because he knows he's losing control of the narrative. That phrase again, control of the narrative. It had defined everything Richard had done for years. And now? I asked. Now he's going to try to rewrite the ending. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Margaret called me again. He wants to settle. I stared at the phone for a moment before responding. Settle? Yes. Now he's going to try to rewrite the ending. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Margaret called me again. He wants to settle. I stared at the phone for a moment before responding. Settle. Yes. My heart started beating faster. What kind of settlement? Financial? Of course. Always financial. How much? I asked. She paused. More than what he would have offered a few weeks ago. That didn't surprise me. What's the condition? That the case ends quietly. I let out a slow breath. There it was. Not justice. Not truth. Silence. He wants it to disappear, I said. Yes. I sat down slowly, my mind racing. How much are we talking about? Margaret told me. And for a moment I didn't know what to say, because it was more money than I had ever imagined having in my own name. More than enough to start over. More than enough to be comfortable. More than enough to walk away and never look back. I struggled to find the word. A lot. Yes, she said calmly. I closed my eyes. For a moment, everything else faded. The courtroom, the evidence, the years, all replaced by one simple thought: I could end this right now. No more stress, no more hearings, no more reliving everything that had happened. Just peace. Fiona Margaret's voice pulled me back. Yes, I need you to think very carefully about this. No, she said gently. You're thinking emotionally. I opened my eyes. What do you mean? I mean, she continued, that this offer is designed to appeal to your exhaustion. She wasn't wrong. I was exhausted, more than I had ever been. I just want this to be over, I admitted. I know. Her voice softened slightly. But ending it this way comes at a cost. What cost? She didn't hesitate. The truth. The word settled heavily in the silence between us. He gets to keep control of the story, she added. I felt my chest tighten. And you walk away with money, but without acknowledgement. I swallowed. Does acknowledgement really matter? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me a question. What matters to you? I didn't respond right away, because I didn't know. Not completely. Money mattered. Of course it did. Security mattered. Freedom mattered. But there was something else. Something harder to define. Something deeper. I spent years not understanding what was happening to me, I said quietly. Yes, and now that I do, I paused. I don't want it to disappear like it never mattered. Something deeper. I spent years not understanding what was happening to me, I said quietly. Yes, and now that I do, I paused. I don't want it to disappear like it never mattered. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That was my answer. That evening, Lauren came over. She could tell something was different the moment she walked in. What happened? I took a deep breath. Your father wants to settle. Her eyes widened. Already? Yes, that's fast. It is. She sat down across from me. What's the offer? I told her. Her reaction was immediate. Mom, that's a lot. I know. You could just end this. Her words echoed exactly what I had been thinking earlier. I could. It is. She sat down across from me. What's the offer? I told her. Her reaction was immediate. Mom, that's a lot, I know. You could just end this. Her words echoed exactly what I had been thinking earlier. I could. She studied my face. But you're not going to, are you? I looked at her. No. She nodded slowly. Good. The certainty in her voice surprised me. You think that's the right choice? I think it's your choice, she said. But if you ask me, she hesitated briefly. He doesn't deserve a quiet ending. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were harsh, but because they were honest. He controlled everything for so long, she continued. And now that he's being exposed, he just wants it to go away. I nodded. That's what it looks like. She leaned forward slightly. Then don't let him. I felt something settle inside me, a clarity I hadn't had before. Not emotional, not reactive, just clear. The next morning, I sat across from Margaret again. She didn't ask what I had decided. She already knew. You're declining, she said. I nodded. Yes. She allowed herself a small smile. Good. You think so. I think it means you understand what this is really about. I exhaled slowly. It's not just about money. No, she said. It never was. I looked down at my hands. For years, I thought winning meant security. And now I looked back up at her. Now I think it means being seen. She nodded. Exactly. Margaret stood and gathered her files. I'll inform his attorney. What happens next? She met my eyes. Now I think it means being seen. She nodded. Exactly. Margaret stood and gathered her files. I'll inform his attorney. What happens next? She met my eyes. Now we finish this. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty. And for the first time since this entire process began, I felt the same thing. Because Richard had made his final move. He had offered everything he thought I wanted. And I had said no. Not because I didn't value it, but because I finally understood something he never expected me to realize. That some things are worth more than money. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't choosing comfort. I was choosing truth. The day of the ruling didn't feel like I expected. There was no dramatic tension when I woke up. No overwhelming anxiety. No sense of panic. Instead, there was a quiet stillness, as if everything that could be said had already been said. Everything that could be revealed had already come to light. And now, all that remained was the truth. I stood in front of the mirror that morning longer than usual, not fixing my hair, not adjusting my clothes, just looking. Looking at a woman I barely recognized, not because she had changed physically, but because something inside her had shifted. Something permanent. Something that would never go back to what it was before. Lauren knocked gently on my bedroom door. Mom, come in. She stepped inside, her expression soft but steady. Are you ready? I nodded. Yes. She smiled faintly. Me too. As we drove to the courthouse, neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. The case had already been made. The story had already been told. Now we were just waiting to hear how it would end. When we entered the courtroom, Richard was already there, sitting in the same seat, wearing the same calm expression, but something about him felt smaller. Not physically, but in presence. As if the weight of everything that had been exposed had finally settled in. He glanced at me briefly. For a moment, our eyes met. And in that moment, I didn't see the man I had once trusted. I saw someone else entirely. Someone I had never truly known. The judge entered. The room stood, then sat. And just like that, everything became real. The judge began speaking, carefully, deliberately, reviewing the evidence, the testimony, the timeline. Every word felt measured, precise, not emotional, not dramatic, just factual. But those facts carried weight, more weight than anything Richard had ever said. The court recognizes the judge began a consistent pattern of financial control and information restriction within the marriage. My chest tightened, because hearing it spoken out loud made it undeniable. Not just something I felt, not just something I believed, but something officially recognized, proven, validated. The evidence demonstrates that significant financial decisions were made without full transparency or mutual understanding. I felt Lauren's hand gently squeeze mine. The court also notes the existence of asset transfers conducted in a manner that limited the plaintiff's awareness and involvement. Richard shifted slightly in his seat. Just enough to notice, not enough to hide. The judge continued. While these actions may have been structured within legal boundaries. There was a brief pause. Their cumulative effect reflects a pattern inconsistent with equitable marital conduct. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just about legality. It was about fairness, about truth, about the reality behind the paperwork. Then came the part I hadn't fully allowed myself to think about. The court orders a reevaluation of marital assets, including those transferred through third-party entities. I felt my breath catch. The plaintiff is entitled to a fair and equitable share of all relevant assets, including those previously undisclosed. A quiet wave of relief moved through me. Not overwhelming, not explosive, just steady, real. The judge continued outlining the specifics, the percentages, the adjustments, the corrections. It wasn't everything. It wasn't some dramatic reversal where I suddenly won everything. But it was fair, truly fair. More fair than anything Richard had ever expected. And more fair than I had once believed possible. When the judge finished speaking, the room remained quiet. There was no applause, no reaction. Just the quiet understanding that something significant had just happened, something final. Something that couldn't be undone. I looked at Richard for the first time. He didn't look confident. He didn't look composed. He looked stunned, not dramatically, not visibly shaken, but subtly, like someone who had just realized that something they had relied on completely had failed. Not partially, not temporarily, but completely. As we stood to leave, Lauren hugged me tightly. "You did it," she whispered. I closed my eyes for a moment. "No," I said softly. "We did it, because I hadn't done this alone." Not really. Margaret, Lauren, every piece of truth that had surfaced along the way, it had all led here. Outside the courtroom, Margaret joined us. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. That went exactly as expected, she said. I let out a small breath. I didn't know what to expect. She nodded. That's normal. Lauren smiled. So, it's over. Margaret considered the question. The legal part, mostly. And the rest? Margaret glanced at me. That's up to Fiona. I understood what she meant. Because the ruling had settled the case. But it hadn't defined what came next. That part was mine. As we walked toward the exit, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief. Not exactly. Something deeper. Something quieter. Closure. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because the truth had been acknowledged, seen, recognized, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, I wasn't invisible anymore. Behind us, I heard footsteps. I turned slightly. Richard. He was walking toward us, slowly, deliberately. For a moment, I considered walking away, but I didn't. I stayed. He stopped a few feet in front of me. Neither of us spoke right away. Then he said something I never expected to hear. I didn't think you would go this far. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not regret, not apology, something else. I didn't think I would either, I replied. He nodded slightly. Then he said something that revealed more than he probably intended. You didn't need to do all of this. I looked at him. Yes, I said quietly. I did. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if he still didn't understand. And maybe he never would. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. Because for the first time, I saw him exactly as he was. Not the man I had believed in, not the version he had presented to the world, but the truth. And that truth no longer had power over me. The first morning in my new home felt unfamiliar. Not because the house was large. It wasn't. In fact, it was smaller than the one I had lived in for nearly 3 decades. But it was mine, entirely mine, and that made everything feel different. The sunlight came through the windows in a way I hadn't noticed before. The quiet wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. For years, silence had meant uncertainty. Now, it meant freedom. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee, looking around at the simple space I had chosen for myself. No grand dining table, no carefully arranged decorations meant to impress guests. Just what I needed. Nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. Lauren arrived later that morning. She knocked twice before letting herself in. I still can't believe this is your place, she said, smiling as she stepped inside. I laughed softly. Neither can I. She walked around slowly, taking everything in. It's you, she said finally. I tilted my head. What do you mean? It feels calm, she explained. Real? I smiled. That's exactly what I wanted. We sat together in the living room, sunlight filling the space. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me. How do you feel? It was a simple question, but not an easy one. I thought about it carefully. Lighter, I said. She nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. But also, I hesitated. What? Stronger? She smiled. I can see that. I leaned back slightly. For so long, I didn't realize how much I was holding in. What do you mean? Questions, I said. Doubts. things that didn't feel right but I ignored. She looked thoughtful. You trusted him? Yes, I said quietly. I trusted him completely. And now, I met her eyes. Now I trust myself. The words felt different as I said them. Not defensive, not forced, just true. That afternoon, I went somewhere I hadn't been in years. The local library, the same one where I had once worked, the same place I had left behind when Lauren was young. As I walked through the doors, a wave of memories hit me. The smell of books, the quiet hum of conversation, the soft turning of pages. It all felt the same. And yet I wasn't the same person walking in. A familiar face looked up from behind the desk. Fiona. I smiled. Hi, Susan. Her eyes widened. It's been years, I know. She walked around the desk and hugged me warmly. How are you? I hesitated for just a second. Then I answered honestly. I'm starting over. She pulled back slightly, studying my face. Well, she said gently, you look like you're doing it right. I laughed softly. I'm trying. We talked for a while. About the past. About the present. About how things had changed. Before I left, I asked something I hadn't planned to ask. Do you need volunteers? Susan smiled immediately. Always. I felt something settle inside me. Good, I said, because I'd like to come back. Not as I had been before, not dependent, not uncertain, but as someone choosing to be there, for herself. Not because someone else decided it made sense. As I walked out of the library, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't miss the life I had before. Not the house, not the structure, not the version of stability I had once believed in. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. Stability that comes from control isn't stability at all. It's just quiet imbalance. That evening, I sat on my small back porch, watching the sky slowly change colors as the sun set. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, the kind of moment I used to rush past. Now I let myself sit in it, fully, present. My phone buzzed softly beside me. A message from an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. It was Richard. I underestimated you. I read the message twice, then set the phone down. For a long moment, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized I didn't need to say anything. A few minutes later, another message appeared. I never message appeared. I never thought you would go this far. I exhaled slowly. Then finally, I replied. Neither did I. I put the phone away, not waiting for a response, not needing G1, because whatever he thought now, ought you would go this far. I exhaled slowly. Then finally, I replied. Neither did I. I put the phone away, not waiting for a response, not needing one, because whatever he thought now, whatever he understood or didn't understand, it no longer defined me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to him. I wasn't adjusting to him. I wasn't living within the boundaries he had set. I was simply living. And that felt like the greatest victory of all. People often think the moment everything ends is the moment everything changes. For me, that wasn't true. The courtroom didn't change me. The ruling didn't change me. Even leaving Richard didn't fully change me. What changed me was everything that came before. The questions I had finally allowed myself to ask. The truth I had finally chosen to see. The voice I had finally decided to use. Weeks passed after the case ended. Then months. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still quiet moments where memories would surface. Moments where I would question myself. Not because I doubted what had happened, but because I was learning how to live differently, independently, and that took time. One afternoon, I sat across from Margaret Ellis for the last time, not as a client, but as someone saying goodbye. "I never thanked you properly," I said. She smiled slightly. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." She leaned back in her chair. "For what I thought about it, not just the case, not just the outcome. For showing me that this wasn't just about money." She nodded. "It rarely is." I smiled faintly. "You saw things I didn't even realize were happening." "That's because you were inside it," she said. "It's always harder to see from the inside." I paused. "There's something I've been thinking about." "What's that?" I hesitated. "Why did he fear you?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then she said something that stayed with me long after I left her office. "Because I don't just challenge what people do," she said. "I challenge the story they build around it." I felt a quiet understanding settle inside me, because that was exactly what Richard had done, for decades. He hadn't just controlled finances, he had controlled the story. The version of our life that everyone believed, including me. And when that story was challenged, everything began to fall apart. That evening, I sat on my back porch again, the same place where I had first begun to feel like myself again. The sun was setting slowly, casting soft light across the yard. I held a cup of tea in my hands, letting the warmth settle into me. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to reflect, not on what I had lost, but on what I had gained. I had gained clarity. I had gained independence. I had gained something I didn't even realize I had been missing. My voice. For so many years, I believed that being a good partner meant trusting without question. That love meant letting someone else take the lead. That security came from not needing to understand everything. But now I understood something different. Trust should never require silence. Love should never require blindness. And security should never come at the cost of your own awareness. I thought about the woman I had been all those years ago. The woman who signed documents without reading them. The woman who apologized for asking questions. The woman who believed that not knowing was the same as being safe. I didn't judge her. I didn't resent her, because she had done the best she could with what she understood at the time. But I wasn't her anymore, and that was the real victory. My phone buzzed softly beside me. This time, it wasn't Richard. It was Lauren. "Thinking about you. Love you." I smiled and replied, "Love you too." Simple, honest, real. The kind of communication I had once taken for granted. Now I valued it differently, because I understood how easily truth could be hidden behind something that looked like care. As the sky darkened, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet, to my own thoughts, to the life I was now fully present in. And I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore, not at Richard, not at the past, not even at the years I had spent not knowing, because anger belongs to a moment. but understanding belongs to a lifetime. And what I had gained was far greater than what I had lost. Because in the end, Richard hadn't just feared losing money. He hadn't even feared losing the case. What he feared most was losing control of the story. And that's exactly what happened. Because the moment I began telling the truth, the story was no longer his. It was mine. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how I wanted to tell it. After everything I've been through, I've spent a lot of time asking myself one simple question. How does something like this happen without you even realizing it? And the answer isn't simple. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, through small decisions, through trust that feels natural, through moments where you choose peace over questions, until one day you realize you no longer have the full picture of your own life. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never disconnect yourself from your own life, especially your finances, your decisions, your voice. Trust is important. Love is important. But understanding is just as important. Asking questions doesn't mean you're disloyal. Protecting yourself doesn't mean you don't love someone. And it is never, ever too late to take your life back. I was almost 60 when I finally understood that. And if you're watching this right now, I want you to know something. It's not too late for you either. So now, I want to ask you, have you ever trusted someone so much that you stopped asking questions? Or have you ever had to find your voice again after years of silence? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, and you are not alone. And before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe if this story meant something to you. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Because wherever you are, I hope this story reminds you that your voice matters more than you think.